We live in interesting times. Yet, one day, this pandemic will be behind us. And we know that because it's not the first pandemic that humanity has experienced. And when this pandemic is over, there are likely going to be other new diseases that emerge in the future. Well, have you ever wondered what sort of diseases they might be, or when they may emerge? Well, spoiler alert, we're not going to answer those questions exactly in this podcast. But we are going to gain some insights that will allow us to sharpen our ability to think about where and when the next new human diseases might emerge. Hi, I'm Kevin Gross, a faculty member in the statistics department at NCSU. I'm interested in math and the outdoors, and I've spent my career trying to combine the two. And that's led me here, speaking with you about how new human diseases began, and why that seems to be happening more often these days. There really won't be any statistics in this podcast per se, but we will talk about probability, which is closely related to statistics. So today, we'll discuss a phenomenon known as spillover, which refers to the process by which microbes that reside discretely in non-human animals become human pathogens. You've heard about all the microbial diversity that we share our world with: viruses, bacteria, protists, and so on, including the microbes that live in and on us and make us who we are. Well, what's true of humans in this case is true of the rest of the animal kingdom also. All creatures great and small are colonized by a wealth of microbes, and those microbes are what allow each animal to function as the creature that we know it to be. For an eel to function as an eel, or for a coral to be a coral. The word spillover refers to when one of these microbes that reside unobtrusively in a non-human species becomes a parasite of a human, and then potentially goes on to emerge as a new human disease. Even the term spillover is meant to evoke this idea that the microbe exists in large supply on its non-human host, a reservoir of microbes, if you will. And then when an unlucky person bumps up against that reservoir, some of the microbes slosh out and become a new human pathogen. Of course, we strongly suspect that the new coronavirus appeared as the result of a spillover, and the search is on to confirm that. But spillovers are not just about coronaviruses. In fact, 60% of human infectious diseases either regularly cross or have recently crossed from non-humans to humans. These include a whole rogues gallery of pathogens, many of which you probably haven't heard of, such as Nipah virus, for example. Some of which you probably have heard of, such as Ebola and Lyme disease. And then some that you've absolutely heard of, and that shape our world profoundly, such as the coronaviruses, the influenzas, and HIV. Yet, most of the examples of spillovers that we know of are relatively recent. Why is that? Is it just that we're more aware now, or have better technologies to detect spillovers? Or are spillovers becoming more common? And if they are becoming more common, why? In a word, yes, spillovers are becoming more frequent. Of course, when we say that, we have to account for the fact that modern biotechnology allows us to detect much more than we ever could. But even accounting for that, yes, spillovers seem to be happening with increasing frequency. To be sure, they're not exclusively a modern phenomenon. The great bubonic plagues of the past, such as the Black Death in the 14th century, likely resulted from spillover of the responsible bacterium, in this case from rodents, perhaps helped along by a flea. But even though spillovers are not exclusively modern, they are more common today. Take coronaviruses. Prior to the turn of the 21st century, the only known coronaviruses in humans were 4 types that cause nothing worse than the common cold. In the past 20 years, however, 3 new, more lethal coronaviruses have emerged. The first SARS outbreak in 2003, which is thought to have jumped from a bat reservoir. The virus that causes Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which first jumped from camels to humans in 2012, and now the new coronavirus. 3 in 20 years. That's a pattern. It's a pattern that typifies the larger rise in the emergence of new human diseases. It's a pattern that warrants further investigation. So, let's dig in and try to find some explanations. First, before going any further, I don't want to get too bogged down in terminology, but I do want to clarify a few concepts. To be precise, a spillover refers to a single focused event when a new pathogen first infects a person. It happens at a point in time. On the other hand, the sequence of events that the spillover may trigger, which ultimately lead to a widely spread human disease, is a more gradual process that we'll refer to as emergence. Not all spillover events lead to emergence, of course, and in fact, most don't. But the processes underlying spillover differ from those underlying emergence, so it's helpful to keep those two parts of the story distinct. Second, the non-human animal host in which the microbe permanently resides is called the reservoir host. Typically, the reservoir host and the microbe share a long evolutionary history together, and so the microbe doesn't cause disease in the reservoir host. Finally, a human disease that originates from a non-human animal is called a zoonosis, and the disease is called a zoonotic disease. And yes, if you're curious, it can go the other way too. An anthropognosis is a microbe from a human reservoir that causes disease in a non-human host. We don't know of as many examples of anthropognoses, but there are a few. Now that we've got these definitions out of the way, what are the necessary ingredients for spillover and emergence? For spillover, the essential ingredient is, maybe obviously, a close interaction between the reservoir species and a human. Take HIV. HIV evolved from a pathogen called simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, which resides in various species of monkeys and apes. HIV is thought to have jumped to humans from SIV in chimpanzees, likely in Central Africa a little over 100 years ago. We'll never know exactly how that occurred, of course, but one possibility is that a hunter butchered an infected chimp while having an open wound and managed to infect himself with the chimp's blood. Or consider plague. The plague bacterium resides in rodents, and the Great Black Death of the Middle Ages is thought to have begun on sailing ships and in port cities, which concentrated humans, rats, and fleas together in close proximity. Yet, often the pathogen doesn't jump directly from the reservoir species to a human. There's often another species that acts as something of a bridge between these two, called the amplifier host. In this case, the pathogen jumps first from the reservoir host to the amplifier host. The amplifier host gets sick, and then, as the name amplifier suggests, produces lots of the pathogen, which then creates an infectious dose for a person. As an example, though it's somewhat obscure in this part of the world, is the Nipah virus, spelled Nipah, which is a nasty virus that infected a few hundred people who were in close contact with pigs in Southeastern Asia in 1999. In this case, the pigs themselves weren't the reservoir. Instead, they were only the intermediate amplifier host. The reservoir host in this case was a species of fruit bat. The Nipah virus went first from the bat to the pig. Again, we'll never know exactly how, but maybe a bat fed on a fruit tree next to a pigsty and dropped some discarded fruit pulp into the sty that was filled with bat saliva, and the pigs ate up the discarded fruit pulp. Then the pigs became sick and infected their human handlers. As another example, the coronavirus that caused the 2003 SARS outbreak is thought to have originated by a similar pathway. In that case, the reservoir host was another species of bat called the horseshoe bat, and the amplifier host was a mongoose-like creature called a palm civet. The virus likely passed from the bat to the palm civet in a live animal market, and then from the palm civet into humans. So, in a nutshell, the essential ingredient for spillover is close contact between a human and the reservoir host, either directly or more often helped along by an amplifier host. Now, for the pathogen to then emerge into humans, the second essential ingredient is close contact between humans, and enough human-to-human contact that each infected person, on average, infects one or more other people before the originally infected person recovers or dies. The large majority of spillovers sputter out without making much of a ripple in the broader world beyond infecting the first human host and possibly their close companions. Why? Well, most likely a pathogen that spills over isn't capable of being transmitted easily from one person to another, and so either the first infected human never infects anyone else, or infects a few others who in turn don't infect anyone else, and the pathogen dies out in humans without ever being diagnosed as something new. But pathogens change through the process of mutation, and sometimes the new pathogen may mutate to a form that can be more readily transmitted between humans. Yet, even then, emergence isn't assured. Perhaps the first infected human is quickly isolated by her community or village, or just recovers quickly before passing the infection on to anyone else. Yet, on rare occasions, a pathogen may acquire a mutation that allows it to be transmitted from human to human, and the first infected person unwittingly infects one or more other people, the secondary cases, who then each go on to unwittingly infect a few more individuals, and so on, thus launching the chain reaction that leads to an emerging disease. Once a chain of transmission of this sort begins, it can grow quickly if potentially infectious contacts between people happen frequently, as they might when people live densely, or if the infected hosts are especially mobile, and thus able to seed new chains of infection in geographically distant places. So, those are the key ingredients for spillover and emergence. Close contact between an animal and a human, the pathogen acquiring the ability for human-to-human transmission, and a network of potentially infectious contacts between humans. But there's a subtlety here, and that subtlety will bring us back to the question that we initially posed about why emerging zoonotic diseases are more common today. That subtlety is that if you take these ingredients and mix them together, you don't necessarily get a new human disease per se. What you get instead is the opportunity for a new human disease to spill over and to emerge. Spillover and emergence require a series of events to occur, each one of which is unlikely at any given place and time. A tourist visiting a cave full of roosting bats is not likely to acquire a new respiratory virus from those bats. A horse munching on a fig that a bat has partially eaten is not likely to become an amplifier host for the next human pandemic. Even a new microbe that does spill over is unlikely to have the particular configuration of genes needed for direct human-to-human transmission, and so on. But, and here's where the probability comes in, give an unlikely event enough opportunities, and eventually, even those unlikely events will occur. Forgive the sports analogy. I'm a terrible basketball player, and if I take a shot from midcourt, it's almost sure to miss. But give me enough tries, enough opportunities, and eventually, one of those shots is going to go in. Something similar is true for disease emergence. Give the natural world enough opportunities for a reservoir host to infect an amplifier host, and for the amplifier host to infect a human, and for that human to initiate a chain of subsequent infections leading to an epidemic, and eventually, with enough opportunity, even this series of unlikely events will come to pass. And that's what the modern world provides, more so than it ever has before, is opportunities for spillover and emergence. Markets, zoos, and sanctuaries that hold many different animal species together in close proximity create opportunities for spillover. Deforestation brings people and livestock up to the forest's edge or to the jungle's edge and creates opportunity for spillovers. Dense and interconnected cities where people pack themselves shoulder to shoulder into subway cars and then fly across a continent and back and call it all part of a day's work create opportunities for new pathogens to spread quickly and emerge. All of these features of our modern world create opportunities for spillover and emergence, opportunities that have never before existed in such abundance. So, where does that leave us? If what the modern world creates is opportunity, then the exact when and where and how of the next spillover event isn't predictable in its particulars. Once this current pandemic has passed, where and when will the next new disease emerge? Well, with respect to the particulars, there's no way of knowing exactly, because a spillover and an emergence require the unlikely to happen. That against long odds, the half-court shot goes in. But in the long run, as opportunities accumulate over the sweep of continents and decades, there is predictability. New pathogens will emerge, and we can predict the conditions that will make this more likely, some in ways that we've discussed today, and in other ways that will be the topic of future segments. For example, more likely than not, an emerging pathogen will be a virus, and a particular type of virus at that, called an RNA virus. The explanation for why is a topic for a future segment. Before we conclude, if you're thinking about being a biologist and looking for a hot question to work on, here's one. More likely than not, the next pathogen to cause a human epidemic is lurking right now somewhere in a bat. Why bats? What is it about bats that makes them such a competent reservoir host for new human diseases? We really don't know. It might be that bats are just super diverse. Believe it or not, bats make up 20% of all mammal species on Earth. They're mobile because they fly, so there's that. And they're mammals, so their biology is not radically different from ours. There's a hypothesis out there right now that bats have unusually tolerant immune systems so that their bodies can endure all of the metabolic challenges that flight brings. But these are just leading hypotheses, and no one knows for sure why bats are such good reservoir hosts. It's a question that could use a good answer, and asking it and others like it will help us prepare for what the future holds.